Buried beneath the earth, a mountaineer's ingenious cellar was mocked by settlers, but when the brutal winter came, it would prove to be his family's salvation. In the relentless cold of the Appalachian Mountains, survival would depend on a secret no one believed. Before we dive in, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if stories like this ignite your sense of adventure, hit that subscribe button, because the next chapter might just shock you even more. It was the early days of winter when Elias Burke first dug the hole. Settlers who passed by his homestead in the rugged Appalachian foothills laughed behind his back, dismissing the cellar he was constructing as an eccentric folly. To them, it seemed out of place. The mountaineers were stubborn, their lives carved out of the tough earth beneath their feet. But building a home in the dirt was something no one had seen before. Elias, however, knew exactly what he was doing. His back ached as he sank his shovel deeper into the frozen soil, carving out what would become the foundation of his survival. His thick woolen coat, worn and patched from years of use, flapped as he worked, the bristling wind stinging his face. Elias knew the cold was coming. He could feel it in his bones, and the air had turned sharp with each passing day. His family depended on him, not just for warmth, but for life itself. His wife, Mary, would often stand at the door, watching him work through the frost, her hands wrapped tightly around a wooden spoon or a thick woolen blanket she had just finished knitting. Their children, Sarah and Thomas, huddled around the hearth inside, their eyes peering out from the small window, gazing with curiosity and worry. "Why are you digging so deep, Pa?" Sarah asked one evening as he came in from the cold, his face lined with exhaustion. He grinned, wiping his brow. "Sometimes the earth keeps us warmer than any fire," he said, his voice hushed, but full of conviction. The cellar wasn't just a hole, it was a sanctuary. The settlers couldn't see it, but he knew this underground refuge would hold the warmth they would need to survive. As the winter began to settle in, Elias worked feverishly, not caring for the whispers of the settlers who passed through his land. They didn't understand the mountain winds or the biting cold that would come from the north. To them, he was simply a fool wasting time. Yet to Elias, the earth was his ally, and soon they would understand. By the end of November, the winds had already started howling. A thick, pale fog clung to the valleys, and the frost on the ground seemed to spread with a chilling finality. The once bustling Appalachian town near Elias's cabin had quieted, as though nature itself was holding its breath. Most of the settlers had finished preparing for the season, their homes warm and stocked with supplies, but none had prepared like Elias. The cellar was ready. The final touches had been made just in time. Elias finished covering the heavy wooden door with layers of stone and earth, ensuring that no heat would escape. Inside, it was surprisingly dry and secure, with walls made of packed dirt and timber supports that would withstand the weight above. A small flickering lantern cast its soft glow inside, revealing shelves stocked with preserved vegetables, jars of salted meats, and a few crates of dried fruits. This wasn't just storage, it was a lifeline. As Elias lowered the door, sealing the entrance with a heavy stone, the wind picked up, roaring through the trees, shaking the house on its foundations. It was clear that this was no ordinary winter storm. The northern winds had arrived earlier than expected, and with them came a brutality that even the settlers couldn't ignore. By nightfall, a thick blanket of snow covered the land. The temperature dropped to an unbearable low, and soon the snow piled high against the door to Elias's cabin, sealing him and his family inside. Inside the cellar, the temperature remained stable. The ground below kept the cold at bay, while the stone walls trapped the warmth from their modest fire. Mary and the children huddled around the flickering flame in the small room above, their breath visible in the freezing air. They could hear the wind howling outside, but it was a distant sound, like something from another world. Elias stood in the doorway, looking out over the snow-covered landscape. He knew the storm would pass, but how long it would last, he couldn't tell. He had spent so many years in the mountains, But even he hadn't expected the brutal fury of this winter. He walked over to the cellar door, pressing his hand against the cool wood. There was no doubt now. They were going to survive this winter, thanks to the earth itself. The settlers had laughed, but now when the frost clung to their own homes and their fires sputtered out, they would wish they had been more like Elias. He had built his future, one shovelful of dirt at a time. The family gathered close together in the warm glow of their lantern. In the coming weeks, they would come to depend more on this humble shelter than they could have ever known. The land and the ingenious cellar beneath it would keep them alive, though no one could yet fathom the extent of their struggle and triumph. Days passed, and the storm outside never relented. What began as a single evening of snow turned into a relentless siege, burying the Appalachian mountains in a blanket of white. Elias could hear the wind wailing through the gaps in the walls of the cabin, the howl of nature's fury just outside their door. But inside, his family remained safe. The cellar had already proven its worth, keeping the cold from reaching them, and the meager fire that burned in the hearth had become an afterthought. Mary, always practical, had begun rationing their food, ensuring that every piece of preserved meat, every jar of fruit, and every handful of dried beans went into carefully measured portions. She had known the hard times of the mountains, but she had never seen a winter like this. Even the wolves that howled at night were quieter than usual, as if they too were hiding from the merciless storm. At first, Elias had been content to let the storm pass, waiting for the day when he could venture out to check on the traps he had set earlier in the fall. But as the days turned into weeks and the snow piled up even higher, it became clear that leaving the warmth of the cellar was not an option. The path to the nearest settlement had disappeared under the snow, and even the animals that usually ventured out of the woods seemed to have taken shelter. The fire crackled in the hearth, providing a small measure of comfort, but it did little to combat the isolation that was starting to creep into their hearts. Elias felt it most. His rugged hands would linger on the walls, as if trying to feel the world beyond, but the cold in the air told him that nature had fully claimed the land. On the 10th day of the storm, a loud cracking sound broke the silence. Elias's heart raced as he jumped to his feet. A shift in the cabin's frame, perhaps the weight of the snow causing a beam to crack, was the first indication of something gone wrong. His eyes met Mary's, a silent understanding passing between them. It was the first time Elias wondered whether the earth that had shielded them might now turn against them. "I'll check it," he said, his voice steady despite the unease in his gut. Mary, ever pragmatic, nodded. But as Elias stepped outside, the reality of the storm hit him like a wall. The snow was thigh-deep, and the wind whipped across his face like 1,000 needles. The small shelter he had worked so tirelessly to perfect now felt fragile, vulnerable to the power of nature. The storm was pushing the boundaries of their shelter, and Elias was unsure if the stone cellar would hold up under the weight of this unrelenting storm. After hours of working, digging snow away from the structure to relieve pressure, Elias returned to the warmth of the cabin, his body chilled to the bone. But the cellar, the shelter beneath them, had not budged. It stood firm against the elements. Elias took a deep breath, the weight of his decision heavy in his chest. He knew this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was a test of everything he had worked for, every laugh, every doubt, and every whispered comment from the settlers who thought he was foolish. As he entered the cabin, he saw his family's faces, illuminated by the soft glow of the fire. They were waiting for him. And he knew, in that moment, that despite the storm's fury, his family would make it through this winter. The storm raged for weeks, but inside their stone-lined shelter, the Burke family found solace. The world outside had become a white, frozen wasteland, but within their walls there was warmth. It wasn't the comfort of abundance, but it was enough. The cellar, constructed with Elias's careful hands, had withstood the ferocity of the storm and offered more than protection. It offered the promise of life. It was a cold and quiet night when they first realized they weren't alone. The howls of wolves had become a constant soundtrack to their nights. But this night was different. The air felt thick with tension, and Elias found himself standing, listening intently. He heard it first, a faint scratching sound at the door, almost imperceptible beneath the howl of the wind. "Pa, what's that noise?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she clung to her mother. Elias motioned for silence, his hand instinctively going to the rifle hanging by the door. He moved toward the small wooden panel that covered their only window, parting the cloth just enough to peer outside. Through the frost, he could just make out the outline of a large figure, its silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. A bear. The sight of it took Elias's breath away. For a moment, he froze. The last thing he had expected to see was a bear this far into the winter. They had been through this before, back when they had first come to the mountain, when the animals were just as hungry as the people. But now, in the dead of winter, it was as if nature itself was testing them once more. Elias knew that the bear wasn't looking for a fight, but food. He could see the desperation in its movements, circling the cabin, sniffing the air. Elias could almost hear the creature's hunger, feel the same gnawing ache in his own belly. But for now, they were safe. "Stay inside," Elias whispered, his voice low. "I'll handle it." He stepped outside, his boots crunching through the snow, the cold biting at his face. The bear had started to move toward the cellar, clearly searching for any weakness in their defenses. Elias could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but his mind remained calm. His home, his family's refuge, wasn't just a structure. It was a symbol of resilience, and tonight it would prove its worth. With the rifle steady in his hands, Elias aimed at the ground just ahead of the bear, firing a shot that sent a plume of snow into the air. The bear hesitated, ears twitching, its eyes locking with Elias's. The shot had not been intended to harm, only to warn. It worked. The bear turned and lumbered off into the forest, its heavy steps slowly fading into the distance. Elias stood still for a moment, his breath visible in the cold night air. He couldn't help but smile. It wasn't just the cellar that had kept them safe tonight. It was the perseverance that the mountain had taught him. He returned to his family, his heart full. The world outside was harsh and unforgiving, but they had something the wilderness could never take away, a home built from strength, ingenuity, and the unbreakable bond of family. Winter wore on relentlessly, the storm outside unyielding in its power. Days blurred into one another as the snow piled higher and higher, transforming the world into an unrecognizable sea of white. The family's small cabin grew quieter with each passing day. Elias and Mary spent most of their time in the shelter, rationing the dwindling supplies, while Sarah and Thomas occupied themselves with small chores. It was a life of survival, no more, no less. Inside the cellar, the temperature remained stable. Elias had built it with the earth's natural insulation, and despite the wind that howled outside, the cellar maintained a warmth that was not just physical. It was a comforting presence, a shield against the cold and isolation. Mary had become accustomed to the dim light of the lantern, the steady flicker of its flame, casting soft shadows on the walls as she tended to the hearth. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood, the familiar earthy smell of life clinging to their small home. Yet even as the cellar proved to be an unbroken refuge, the price of survival was taking its toll. The firewood supply had begun to dwindle. Elias had stacked enough to last the season, but now, as the storm stretched into its second month, the reality of running low was beginning to settle over him. "There's not enough left for another week," Elias murmured one evening, his voice low as he looked at the pile by the hearth. Mary looked up from the small pot of stew she was stirring, her brow furrowed. "We can't go out in this," she said softly, her words holding the weight of their unspoken fears. Elias stood still for a moment, the harsh realization sinking in. They had enough food to survive another month, but without firewood, they would face an entirely new kind of hardship. It wasn't just the warmth that mattered. It was the ability to cook, to preserve what they had left. Without the fire, survival would become even harder. The snow continued to fall as Elias decided to venture out the following morning. His boots sank into the deep snow as he made his way through the thickening storm to the small stand of trees that he had marked earlier in the season. The wind bit at his face, stinging the exposed skin as though the mountains themselves were punishing him for his persistence. But Elias didn't stop, not now. The trees were buried beneath layers of snow, their branches heavy with the weight of winter. Elias knew he could not cut them down entirely. He would have to take only what he needed, using the axe he had carefully sharpened before the season's first frost. His hands were raw, his muscles screaming as he chopped, but he kept going. Every swing of the axe brought him closer to the warmth that he knew his family needed to survive. By the time Elias had gathered enough wood, the storm had worsened, and he found himself fighting his way back to the cabin, struggling to see beyond the whiteout. Yet, in the face of the storm's fury, he could feel the steady strength of the earth beneath him, the ground that had sheltered his family for so long. It was all they had left now. When he finally returned to the warmth of the cabin, his body exhausted but triumphant, Mary embraced him wordlessly. He had done what he could, and for now, it was enough. The days that followed were cold, colder than Elias had ever known them to be. The storm had not let up, and the wind showed no signs of abating. Each morning, Elias would check the cellar, ensuring the temperature remained constant, and every evening he would stoke the fire, carefully tending to their dwindling supply of wood. The house was quieter now, save for the crackling of the hearth and the occasional sound of snow falling from the roof. The cold was so intense that it seemed to seep into the very bones of the mountains, chilling the air and making every task feel like a monumental effort. Sarah and Thomas played with whatever toys they had managed to bring from town, a few wooden figures and the last remnants of their once precious books, but their laughter was quieter now, as though they understood the weight of the world had fallen on them too. Elias and Mary worked tirelessly to keep the family going, but there was a sense of unease that lingered in the air, an undercurrent of fear that none of them could shake. On the morning of the 4th week of the storm, Elias woke early to a strange stillness. The wind had died down, and the world outside had fallen into a heavy silence. It was as though the mountains had exhaled, releasing the tension they had been holding. The snow had stopped falling, but there was something unnerving about the tranquility. Elias stepped outside, his boots crunching in the newly fallen snow. The sky was a pale gray, and the land stretched out before him, blanketed in a thick layer of snow that sparkled in the weak light. He had to admit it was beautiful, breathtaking even, but something about the silence felt wrong. He moved toward the tree line where the dense forest seemed to stretch endlessly. As he moved deeper into the woods, he noticed the tracks. Large, deep paw prints, too large for any ordinary animal. Elias's heart sank as he realized what they were. The tracks were fresh, barely disturbed by the wind. They were the unmistakable prints of a bear. And the bear had been here, close to the cabin. Too close. He followed the tracks for several hundred yards, the cold seeping through his coat as he trudged through the snow. The bear had moved through the forest with a purpose, its claws digging deep into the earth as it made its way toward the cabin. Elias's pulse quickened as he realized that the animal had been here recently and might still be nearby. As he turned back toward the cabin, Elias felt a sudden unease. The storm had driven the creatures of the wild closer to the settlements, but this bear was different. It had come too close for comfort. He quickened his pace, knowing he had to return to his family. Something was out there, lurking in the snow, waiting. Elias didn't waste time thinking about the bear. There was no time for second-guessing or fear. He made his way quickly back to the cabin, his boots crunching in the snow, his mind racing. The tracks were too fresh, the bear too close. It was a warning, one that he couldn't ignore. When Elias entered the cabin, he found his family huddled near the hearth, the flickering fire casting long shadows against the walls. Mary looked up from the pot she was stirring, her face drawn with exhaustion. She had been working nonstop to keep the family fed, but it was clear that the burden of survival was beginning to weigh heavily on her as well. "We have a problem," Elias said, his voice low. Mary's brow furrowed. "What's wrong?" "The bear. It's close," Elias replied. "Too close." The weight of his words hung in the air, thick with tension. Mary nodded, her eyes wide with concern. She didn't need to ask any more questions. Elias's tone said everything. There was no doubting it. The bear was hungry, and it was getting bolder. Elias moved quickly, gathering his rifle and making sure it was loaded. He turned to Mary. "I need to secure the cellar. Keep the children inside and stay low. Don't open the door for anything. Do you understand?" Mary nodded, though her hands trembled as she adjusted the blankets around Thomas and Sarah. The children had grown quiet, sensing the shift in the air. Their small faces were drawn with worry, but they said nothing. They had grown accustomed to the dangers of the mountains, but this threat was different. Elias wasn't sure if he could protect them from the creature that lurked outside. The minutes stretched long as Elias stepped outside, rifle in hand, the cold biting at his face. He scanned the tree line, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. He knew he had to be cautious. Bears, especially this close to hibernation, were desperate. A hungry bear was a dangerous bear, and Elias had learned to never underestimate their power. He crept toward the edge of the woods, the rifle steady in his hands. Every crack of a branch underfoot made him tense. Every rustle in the snow felt like a threat. The bear could be anywhere. He had no idea how long it had been watching, but he knew it wouldn't take long for the creature to come back. Just as he reached the edge of the forest, a rustle came from the brush to his left. Elias's heart skipped a beat. He crouched low, his rifle aimed, his breath steady despite the mounting tension, and then he saw it. Its massive form moving through the trees, the bear's thick coat blending with the snow. It was bigger than Elias had anticipated. Its eyes locked on him. The air between them thickened with the weight of the moment. Elias's grip tightened on the rifle. He knew this could end in a split second, but he wasn't afraid. He had faced down danger before. What mattered now was protecting his family. With a sharp breath, he steadied himself and waited, watching as the bear paused, sniffing the air. A sound in the distance made it hesitate, and then, in one quick movement, it lumbered back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. Elias exhaled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His body trembled from the adrenaline, but he knew this was far from over. The bear had retreated, but it would return, and soon. Elias had to prepare for the worst. That night, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He had always been aware of the dangers the mountains posed, but there was something different about this bear. It wasn't just the hunger, it was the cunning. The way it had circled the cabin, testing for weakness. Elias knew that this wasn't a random animal. This was a predator that had learned how to survive. Inside the cabin, the air was heavy with silence. Mary had already prepared what little food they had left, and the children were huddled under blankets, trying to sleep. But Elias could see the unease in their eyes. The storm outside had finally relented, but a new kind of tension had settled over the cabin, one that neither fire nor warmth could chase away. Elias sat by the hearth, the flickering flames casting long shadows on the walls. He stared into the fire, his mind racing. He thought about the bear, how it had waited until the storm had passed before approaching. It knew where they were. It knew they were vulnerable. His fingers curled around the worn wood of his rifle. He had to keep his family safe. There was no room for doubt, but as he sat in the quiet cabin, Elias began to feel the weight of the mountain itself pressing down on him. The cold outside wasn't the only enemy. The isolation, the endlessness of winter, the feeling that no one was out there to help. It all made survival feel like an impossible dream. Mary moved beside him, sitting down quietly, her presence a comfort despite the fear she must have been feeling too. She didn't speak at first, simply sat beside him, her hand gently resting on his. "Pa, what if it comes back?" Sarah's voice came from the other side of the room, small and fearful. Elias looked at his daughter, the hope in her eyes slowly fading as the weight of the question sunk in. He had no easy answer. "We'll be ready, Sarah," Elias said softly. "We'll be ready." And so, as the night wore on and the snow continued to fall outside, Elias made a promise to himself, to his family, that no matter what happened, he would fight for them. He would face whatever came with the strength and resolve. He had learned in these mountains. This winter would not break him. It would not break them. Days passed without another sign of the bear. The storm had relented, but winter had not loosened its grip. Elias had no illusions about the danger. The bear would return. It was only a matter of time. In the quiet that followed, he focused on securing the cabin, reinforcing the door and window, shutters with whatever he could find. The cellar, his last great hope, stood firm, but Elias could feel the weight of the wilderness pressing in. The mountain was not kind. Inside, Mary had managed to preserve a bit of their remaining food, but their supplies were running dangerously low. Each night the cold crept further into the cabin, and despite the warmth from the fire and the cellar, there was a sense of dread that lingered in the air. One evening, as Elias worked by the fire, mending his coat and sharpening his knife, Sarah came to him, her eyes wide with concern. "Pa, I saw something," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Near the trees. I think it was the bear." Elias's heart skipped a beat, and he stood immediately, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. He glanced at Mary, who was holding Thomas close, her expression strained. There was no room for doubt now. The bear was close, too close. Elias grabbed the rifle, his breath steady despite the pounding of his heart. He moved toward the door and looked out. The evening light had long since faded, leaving only the pale moonlight to illuminate the snow-covered ground. The trees were swaying gently in the wind, but there was no sign of the bear. "Stay inside," Elias said, his voice firm. "I'll check it out. Don't open the door for anyone but me." Mary nodded, though the fear in her eyes was impossible to miss. She had seen this look before, when Elias had gone hunting in the dead of winter, when he had faced dangers without hesitation. But this time was different. This time, they were no longer simply battling nature's harshness. They were fighting for their lives. Elias stepped outside, the cold air biting into his skin as he trudged through the snow. The world was silent except for the occasional rustling of branches in the wind. But then he saw it, a pair of glowing eyes, reflecting the moonlight from the edge of the trees. The bear was watching him. Elias's grip tightened on the rifle. He was too far from the cabin, and the bear was too close. It was a game of patience now, waiting for the right moment to act. He had faced bears before, but never one this bold, this persistent. The creature wasn't just looking for food, it was testing the limits of their defenses, probing for weaknesses. The air seemed to freeze as he and the bear locked eyes. For a long moment, neither moved, and then, with a sudden growl, the bear charged. Elias fired, the shot ringing out through the night, but the bear was faster than he anticipated. The shot missed. The bear came at him with terrifying speed, its massive form surging toward Elias with relentless fury. Time slowed as Elias's heart raced. His rifle was useless now, it was too close, and his hands were shaking from the cold and adrenaline. He had only moments to act. With a desperate cry, Elias threw the rifle aside and reached for his knife. The bear lunged at him, its claws slashing the air. Elias dodged, but the beast's paw caught his shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground. Pain exploded in his body, but he didn't stop. He scrambled backward, his hands finding the cold, hard earth beneath him as he fought to regain his footing. The bear growled, circling him like a predator, waiting for the final strike. Elias's breath came in ragged gasps as he staggered to his feet, blood dripping from his shoulder. He had to think fast. The bear was big, but Elias was quicker. He knew how to outsmart nature, how to use the land to his advantage. The ground beneath him was slick with snow, and he could feel the cold seeping into his bones. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the terrain. The tree line was close, and he needed to get to it. He needed to put some distance between himself and the beast. With a sudden burst of energy, Elias lunged toward the trees, hoping to outpace the bear. His legs screamed in protest as he pushed himself harder, the bear's growl echoing behind him. He could hear the animal's heavy footsteps as it chased him, determined to make him its prey. But Elias was focused. He couldn't stop now, not when his family depended on him. The trees were ahead, and as Elias reached the nearest one, he swung around, using the trunk as cover. He waited, the tension in the air thick enough to suffocate. His mind raced, formulating a plan. He could hear the bear approaching, but he remained perfectly still, his heart pounding in his chest. When the bear's massive head came into view, Elias struck. With a powerful swing of his knife, he aimed for the soft underbelly of the beast. The blade connected, and the bear let out a blood-curdling roar, staggering back in pain. Elias didn't hesitate. He drove the knife deeper, forcing the animal to retreat. The bear stumbled, blood pouring from the wound, its eyes filled with rage and pain. But Elias wasn't finished. He took one last step forward, slamming the knife into the creature's side, feeling the life drain from it. The bear fell to the ground with a final guttural cry, its body going limp in the snow. Elias stood over it, his chest heaving with exhaustion and relief. The fight was over. He had survived. His family was safe. With shaky hands, Elias turned and made his way back to the cabin. He was battered, bloodied, but alive. And when he stepped inside, he found his family waiting for him, their eyes wide with fear and hope. "We're safe now," he said, his voice rough from the strain. "We're safe." And as the storm outside began to die down, Elias knew that he had won, against the wilderness, against the bear, and against the elements. He had protected his family. The mountains had tested him, but he had endured, and for now, that was enough.